In a quiet suburban neighborhood, Ethan thought he had found the perfect place to settle down, until a seemingly harmless gate he installed to secure his property unleashed a storm of tension. When a Karen from the neighborhood takes it upon herself to challenge his right to privacy, what starts as a small dispute escalates into a dramatic showdown that no one saw coming. But as the confrontation spirals out of control, Ethan discovers something chilling. Sometimes standing your ground can be a fight for much more than just your property. Would he be able to hold his ground, or would the neighborhood's dark undercurrents swallow him whole? It was the kind of quiet that felt too perfect to be real, like the world was holding its breath. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, golden hue over the suburban neighborhood where Ethan had just moved in. The house, tucked at the far end of a winding street, was a welcome change from the chaos of the city. There was space, room to breathe, to stretch out, to find peace. He'd spent the last week unpacking, slowly getting used to the rhythm of the place. Neighbors waved as they passed by, their greetings friendly but distant, as if everyone respected the unspoken rule of maintaining just enough distance to avoid intrusion. At the edge of Ethan's property, behind a row of towering oaks, ran a narrow trail, barely visible through the overgrown brush. It wasn't marked on any maps, yet it seemed well trodden, as though people had been walking it for years. Ethan had noticed it the first day he arrived, curious but uninterested. He'd heard whispers from a few locals that it was a private trail, but no one ever mentioned who owned it. Most seemed content to ignore its existence, as if it was part of the background noise of the neighborhood, a forgotten feature, a relic of the past. The first few days, Ethan took solace in the peace that surrounded him. He could see the world's edges blur into the horizon from his porch, and it felt like he was in control, like he had finally carved out a life that was his own. But that sense of tranquility wouldn't last long. One afternoon, after a long day of work, Ethan stood on the porch sipping his iced tea when he saw a figure emerge from the trees. A woman, early 40s, tall, and dressed in an outfit that screamed authority, walked briskly down the trail. She was heading straight for his gate. Ethan had never seen her before, but she moved like someone who was used to getting what she wanted. Without thinking, he set down his drink. Something about the way she approached unnerved him, as if the peaceful silence of his new life was about to be shattered. He didn't know it then, but that moment would mark the beginning of everything changing. The storm was coming, and Ethan had no idea how violent it would be. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. It was on the third day of walking around the property that Ethan noticed it again. The trail, barely visible beneath the dense undergrowth. It wound its way alongside his property, stretching deep into the woods and disappearing around a bend. The more he looked at it, the more he felt like something wasn't quite right. The edges of the path were worn down, as if years of foot traffic had carved it into the earth. There were no signs or markers, just the worn dirt and crushed leaves beneath his boots. He felt an instinctive pull, as if the trail was beckoning him to follow it, to uncover its secrets. Curiosity gnawed at him. Was it some kind of public path? He'd never seen anyone use it, but the signs of frequent use were clear. He knew he needed answers. So the next morning he ventured into the nearby coffee shop, a small local place where the old-timers gathered. He struck up a conversation with Bob, the barista, who seemed to know everyone in the neighborhood. "You ever notice the trail behind my house?" Ethan asked, trying to sound casual. Bob's eyes flicked to the window, then back to him. "Ah, yeah, the trail. It's been there for decades. Used to be a private path, but people walk it all the time now. Some folks don't even know it's private." "Private?" Ethan raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Yep. It's owned by the estate down the road. Used to be part of the old manor, but the place was sold years ago. The new owners don't mind people using it. Keeps the peace, I guess." Ethan mulled over the information as he sipped his coffee, the idea of a private path running through his property unsettling him. Was he really okay with that? A private path that the public had freely wandered through for years? The very idea made him feel exposed, vulnerable. The allure of the trail, the quiet beauty of it, still lingered in his mind, but so did the gnawing feeling of intrusion. Was this really his home, or was it just another place people felt entitled to wander through? The more he thought about it, the more he questioned whether he could ignore the trail's existence, or whether it was already too late. A decision had to be made, but the choice, it seemed, would soon be out of his hands. Ethan had always prided himself on his independence. It was one of the reasons he'd chosen to move out here, away from the prying eyes of city life. So as he stood on the edge of his property, staring at the trail that had begun to feel like an uninvited guest, a decision solidified in his mind. The trail needed to be blocked. He wasn't trying to be malicious, just protective. The trail was too close, too public for his comfort, and after learning it was a private path, owned by someone who didn't seem to care much about it, the temptation to claim his own space was irresistible. It was simple. Install a gate, something sturdy, something that said, "This is mine." So, that afternoon, Ethan set to work. He went to the hardware store and picked up materials, a solid wooden gate, a few heavy-duty posts, and some tools. He dug the posts into the ground with surprising ease, the rhythmic sound of the shovel striking the earth almost soothing. As he worked, he told himself it was just a small change, just a boundary that needed to be set. No one would even notice. By the time he finished, the gate stood tall and imposing, a silent guardian between his property and the trail. It was an elegant solution, practical and unobtrusive, or so he thought. He stepped back to admire his work, wiping the sweat from his brow, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. For the first time since moving in, he felt truly secure. But no sooner had he turned to head back to the house than he heard the crunch of gravel underfoot, a sound too deliberate to be just the wind. He turned to find a figure standing at the end of the trail, staring directly at the gate. It was the woman, the one from the other day. She was taller than most, with sharp features and a demeanor that immediately signaled authority. Her eyes flicked from the gate to Ethan, and her lips curled into a tight, disapproving smile. "You really did it," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. Ethan felt a flash of irritation but masked it quickly. "It's my property," he said, trying to keep his tone neutral. "I'm just setting some boundaries." Her gaze hardened. "You can't block this trail. It's been used for years, long before you ever moved here. You have no right." Ethan shook his head, a sense of disbelief settling over him. "I didn't block it completely, just put up a gate." She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "That's the same as a barricade. You think you can just—" Before she could finish, a man appeared behind her, walking briskly up the trail. His face was familiar, one of the neighbors, someone Ethan had briefly met during his first week. He wasn't smiling now. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. Ethan tried to keep his voice calm, but the tension was thick. "I just installed a gate. I thought it would give me some privacy." The man looked at the gate, then back at Ethan. "This isn't just your land. This path is part of the neighborhood." "I'm sorry, but I don't care what you think," Ethan said, his patience wearing thin. "I'm entitled to—" Before he could finish, the woman stepped forward again, a phone already in her hand. "I'm calling the authorities. You're about to find out exactly what you're entitled to." The words hung in the air, and in that moment Ethan felt a chill run through him. He hadn't anticipated this, didn't realize how far some people would go to defend what they thought was theirs. The knot in his stomach tightened. He had made a mistake, and now he had no idea how deep this hole was going to get. The next morning, the air was thick with tension. Ethan hadn't slept well, the weight of the previous day's events pressing down on him like an iron bar. As the sun rose, He stood at the window of his living room, staring out at the gate. It seemed so innocent, so simple, yet now it felt like a looming symbol of everything about to unravel. He was lost in thought when the sound of tires crunching on gravel snapped him back to reality. His heart skipped as he glanced out the window again, this time spotting a sleek black SUV pulling into his driveway. The woman, the one from yesterday, was at the wheel. She threw the vehicle in park with a little too much force, the engine growling as she slammed the door and marched toward his house. Ethan froze. He could see it in her stride, the purposeful march, the tight jaw, the way her eyes were locked onto the gate as if it had personally offended her. He didn't need to know her name to understand exactly who she was. Karen, the neighborhood's self-proclaimed guardian of all things public. She was in her 40s, with short, platinum blonde hair and an outfit that screamed entitlement. Too much designer, too little self-awareness. Everyone in the neighborhood knew her, but no one liked her. She had a reputation for making people's lives miserable over the smallest things. And now, Ethan was about to be her next target. The knock on his door was sharp, insistent, like the final blow in a boxing match. Ethan hesitated before opening it, feeling the nervous tension crawl up his spine. "I'm assuming you're the one who put up the gate," Karen said the moment the door creaked open. Her voice was as cold as the steel of the gate itself. Ethan exhaled slowly, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Yes, I did. It's my property." Karen's lips curled into a tight smile, but her eyes were full of anger. "Not anymore. That gate's gotta go, and it's gotta go now. You can't just block a public trail because you feel like it. This trail has been here for years, and I've walked it my whole life. You have no right to restrict access." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. "I'm not blocking it. I just want a little privacy. There's no sign saying it's public, and frankly, it's been a nuisance. I'm within my rights." "Your rights?" she scoffed, stepping closer, her heels clicking against the porch. "You think you can just come in here, throw up a gate, and make everyone else's life miserable because you don't like a few people walking by? You're wrong, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it." Ethan clenched his fists at his sides, trying to keep his cool. "I'm not trying to make anyone's life miserable. I'm just setting a boundary. You don't like it, take it up with the owners of the trail." "Oh, I plan to," she spat. "And I'll be calling the authorities. You'll regret this, believe me." Before he could respond, she turned sharply, as if she'd already won the argument. She wasn't done yet. Ethan could see it in her eyes. This wasn't just about the trail. It was about power. She was used to getting what she wanted, and he was just another obstacle to bulldoze through. As she marched back to her car, he could hear the sharp click of her phone unlocking. And that was when Ethan realized something. This wasn't just a fight about a gate. It was going to be a war he wasn't prepared for. But something in the back of his mind warned him that Karen wasn't the real threat. No, that would come later. Far later. The tension in the air was suffocating as Karen's heels clicked down the porch steps, each step heavier than the last. Ethan stood there, frozen, his mind racing. His chest tightened as the sound of her phone unlocking filled the quiet morning. He knew what was coming. Without even looking at him, she punched in a number, holding the phone to her ear with an almost casual indifference, as if she had done this 100 times before. The cruel irony was clear. She wasn't just annoyed. She was methodically escalating the situation, turning a simple disagreement into something far darker. Ethan watched, his fists clenched at his sides. He couldn't believe this was happening. He had expected an argument, maybe a couple of harsh words, but this felt like it was spiraling out of control. Karen's voice was loud enough for him to hear, even from where he stood. "Yes, I'm calling to report a man who's unlawfully blocking a public trail on his property. He's put up a gate, and it's obstructing the path. I need someone to come out here immediately." Her words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He felt a rush of heat flood his face, followed by a cold knot in his stomach. He opened his mouth to protest, but she didn't give him a chance. "He's refusing to remove the gate," she continued, her tone dripping with venom. "It's been a public path for decades. This is illegal, and I'm scared he's going to escalate it further. You need to send someone right now. He's dangerous." Ethan's mind reeled. Dangerous? The words barely registered. He couldn't comprehend what was happening. She was lying, blatantly twisting the situation in her favor, but the damage was already done. She had pushed the right buttons, said the right words. The call was out there now. The authorities would be coming. He glanced at the gate. It stood there, a simple wooden barrier, a peaceful attempt at privacy. It didn't deserve to be the focus of this storm. His heart thudded in his chest as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. He hadn't just offended a neighbor. He had made an enemy, someone who could destroy his life with a single phone call. Karen's voice continued in the background, but Ethan wasn't listening anymore. His mind was running through every possible outcome, every worst-case scenario. He was unprepared for this. The authorities. What if they didn't believe him? What if they sided with her? The thought sent a chill crawling down his spine. He started pacing, his thoughts racing. The more he tried to calm himself, the more his anxiety mounted. He didn't want to get involved with the law, didn't want this to turn into something bigger. But it was too late now. Karen had already planted the seed, and the 911 operator would soon be sending someone to resolve the issue. The doorbell rang suddenly, a sharp chime that sent Ethan's heart leaping into his throat. A police car. The flashing lights sliced through the calm suburban street like a warning shot. Ethan stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. The blaring red and blue lights sliced through the quiet morning like a knife, casting chaotic shadows across the yard. Ethan's heart thudded in his chest, his breathing shallow as the police car rolled to a stop at the end of his driveway. He stood there frozen, caught between the suffocating realization that this was no longer just a dispute with a neighbor. This was something much bigger and much more dangerous. Two officers stepped out of the car, one a tall, broad-shouldered man with a jawline that could have been chiseled from stone, and the other shorter, more wiry, with an unreadable expression. Ethan could see the flicker of uncertainty in their eyes as they took in the scene. Karen standing at the end of the trail, arms crossed, her stance like a queen waiting to pass judgment. Ethan stood by the gate, his heart hammering, trying to appear calm, but he could feel the nerves crawling beneath his skin. Karen wasted no time. She marched up to the officers, her voice cutting through the air. "This man," she said, pointing directly at Ethan, "has illegally blocked a public trail. He's obstructing a well-established path that has been used by everyone in this neighborhood for decades. He's doing this out of spite, and I'm worried about what he'll do next." Ethan's blood ran cold as he heard her words, but he forced himself to take a deep breath. He could already feel the weight of her accusations pushing against him, but he refused to let it crack his composure. One of the officers, the tall one, turned to Ethan. "Is that true? You blocked a public trail?" "No," Ethan replied, keeping his voice even, his mind racing. "The trail is on my property, and I put up a gate to mark the boundary. It's private land, and I have every right to do so." Karen's eyes widened, and she stepped forward as if she could somehow make herself more imposing. "He's lying. The trail has been open to the public for years. This isn't about a boundary, it's about control, and he's abusing his power. I demand you do something about this." Ethan could feel his patience wearing thin, but he held his ground. The officers exchanged a glance, their faces blank, as they took in the conflicting stories. The taller one spoke again, more slowly now, as if trying to process the situation. "We're going to need to assess this properly. There's no signage here that says it's a private trail." Ethan knew he had to be careful with his words. "I didn't block it completely. The gate is there to restrict foot traffic on my property, which I have every right to maintain. No one told me it was a public path, and honestly, the neighbors use it without permission, Karen scoffed. Oh, please don't play dumb. The whole neighborhood uses this trail. You've turned your little piece of land into a prison for all of us. She glared at the officers, her voice dripping with false sincerity. Do you want to let him get away with this? It's a matter of public safety now. The tension in the air was palpable, the accusations swirling in every direction like an unseen storm. Ethan's hands clenched into fists, but he remained, still trying to gather his thoughts. The second officer, the wiry one, walked toward the trail, his boots crunching on the gravel as he took a closer look at the gate. His eyes narrowed as he examined the surrounding area. This doesn't look like an official public path, he muttered to his partner. Karen's face twisted with frustration. So what? You're just going to take his side? This is absurd. I've lived here for years. Everyone knows this is a public trail. Ethan could feel the heat rising in his chest, but he refused to let it show. He was losing patience. It was clear Karen wasn't going to back down, and the officers seemed unsure, caught in the middle of an escalating standoff. Every word out of Karen's mouth was a little more exaggerated than the last, each accusation more ridiculous. I'm not here to make enemies, Ethan finally said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. I just want to live my life. I don't want conflict, but I can't let people trample all over my property either. Karen took a step toward the officers, her voice rising again. I'm telling you, this man's behavior is erratic. You need to get him to take down the gate. Now! The officers looked between them, clearly torn. The tall officer's brow furrowed, and he spoke quietly to his partner. Ethan could hear bits of their conversation, snippets of doubt creeping into their tone. This is getting out of hand, the shorter officer said, and Ethan realized this wasn't about who was right or wrong anymore. This was about who could make the loudest noise, and Karen, with her power and venom, was making sure she was the one everyone listened to. Ethan's mind raced, the feeling of being trapped in a web of lies and misunderstandings settling like a heavy fog. The officers were leaning toward a decision, and he had no idea which way it was going to fall. One thing was for sure. This wasn't just about a gate anymore. This was a battle for control of his life. And he had no idea how far Karen would push it. The tension was suffocating. Ethan stood frozen by the gate, his mind spinning. The officers were still talking to Karen, their expressions unreadable, but it was clear the situation was only getting worse. Karen, with her relentless accusations, wasn't about to back down. She was digging in her heels, her voice rising, her words increasingly more dramatic. Ethan felt his patience cracking with every exaggerated sentence she spewed. I'm telling you, Karen continued, shaking her head, this man is a menace. If you don't do something, I'll have no choice but to take this further. He's got a history of harassment. Ask anyone around here. Ethan clenched his fists, trying to stay calm. He was losing control of the narrative. The officers, caught in the crossfire, seemed uncertain, unsure of who to believe. Just as Karen's voice began to rise again, the shorter officer, who had been silently examining the situation, took a step forward, his face suddenly shifting. He looked at Karen with an expression that was both knowing and wary, as if something was clicking into place. Wait a minute, the officer said, his voice sharp enough to cut through Karen's tirade. He turned to his partner, the taller officer, his eyes narrowing. Doesn't she look familiar to you? The taller officer blinked, then squinted as he regarded Karen more closely. Yeah, now that you mention it, she does. Ethan, watching this new development unfold, felt a flicker of hope. Was there something in Karen's past that could work in his favor? The shorter officer crossed his arms, his demeanor shifting from neutral to slightly amused. I've dealt with her before. Same kind of situation, always the same playbook. She's a frequent flyer in these types of disputes. Comes in, makes a scene, cries victim, and expects everyone to just back down. Karen's eyes widened. but she quickly masked it with a forced smile. "What are you talking about? That's absurd. I don't—" "No, no," the officer interrupted, his voice steady but firm. "I remember now. You've been involved in several complaints like this, always over things that weren't really problems in the first place. There was that case in Hillcrest last year, wasn't there? A neighbor tried to put up a fence, and you nearly had a stroke because it blocked your view. And then there was the incident with the dog park." The realization hit Ethan like a tidal wave. Karen had a history of bullying, manipulating situations, and using her voice to stir up trouble. It wasn't just this gate. This was a pattern. Karen's face flushed crimson, and she took a step back, suddenly defensive. Those were different situations, and that's not relevant here." The officer's eyes didn't waver, his expression turning from suspicion to a cold, calculated understanding. "It's relevant, Karen. Very relevant. You've made a habit of turning simple issues into personal vendettas. I've seen your playbook before, and I'm not buying it anymore." Ethan felt a surge of relief flood through him, but he kept his composure. He didn't want to get too excited just yet. This could still go either way. The taller officer turned to Ethan, his tone now softer, more sympathetic. "You've been dealing with this for a while, haven't you?" Ethan nodded, his heart still racing. "I just moved here. I didn't know it was going to turn into this. I just wanted some privacy." The officer took a deep breath, turning back to Karen. "I think it's clear to all of us that this isn't an issue of public access, and frankly, if this keeps escalating with no real evidence, we'll have to consider it harassment." Karen's eyes darted nervously between the officers, her earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of their words. She opened her mouth, ready to protest, but the officer cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Ma'am, you've been warned before about stirring up trouble. You've tried to intimidate people into doing things your way before. We won't tolerate it anymore. The gate stays." Ethan could hardly believe it. The officers were actually siding with him. A quiet victory, but a victory nonetheless. Karen's face contorted in rage, her mouth opening and closing as if she couldn't find the words. Finally, she huffed, her entire body trembling with frustration. "This isn't over," she spat, before turning sharply on her heel and storming back toward her SUV. Ethan felt a rush of adrenaline, his body tense, but he knew he couldn't let his guard down. This wasn't the end. It was just a small win in what was likely to be a long, drawn-out battle. As Karen's car roared to life, he realized one thing. Karen might have lost the battle today, but she wasn't the kind of person who took defeat lightly. Still, for now, the gate remained. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Ethan felt like he was finally in control of the situation. But something deep inside him nagged. This was only the beginning. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard as Ethan stood by the gate, the faint hum of tension still lingering in the air. Karen's car had disappeared down the road, her angry words echoing in his mind like a final, bitter note of a song that refused to end. The officers, their job done, lingered for a moment longer, exchanging a few quiet words before heading back to their car. As the engine roared to life and the flashing lights dimmed, the world seemed to return to its normal rhythm. Birds chirped in the distance, the rustling leaves sounded the same as they always had. But for Ethan, the world had irrevocably changed. The gate remained where it was. The boundary he'd marked now stood as a silent testament to the struggle that had unfolded. For a brief, fleeting moment, Ethan almost felt guilty. He hadn't wanted things to escalate this far. But then, he reminded himself, he had a right to his privacy. No one had the right to trample over his peace, no matter how loud or persistent they were. He watched as the last of the police car's taillights disappeared into the dusk. The neighborhood, once serene, now felt different to him. There were whispers. In the wind, things unsaid but understood. He'd learned the hard way that not all people had good intentions, no matter how polite they seemed on the surface. He'd been introduced to the true nature of his neighbors, not all of them perhaps, but certainly Karen, and that realization left a bitter taste in his mouth. As the days went on, the usual rhythms of the neighborhood slowly resumed. People went about their business, their lives untouched by the drama that had unfolded. But Ethan couldn't ignore the subtle shifts, the sideways glances, the hushed conversations, the people who now kept their distance from him. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him when he walked down the street. Karen had been loud. She had been vocal. But there was something far more dangerous about those quiet, unspoken judgments. Still, he couldn't let it get to him. The lesson was clear. He had stood his ground, even when it felt like the world was crashing down around him. The confrontation had been a trial by fire, but he'd emerged from it stronger, more resolute. And though he knew there would be more challenges ahead, he was no longer afraid. There would always be people like Karen, people who saw power in intimidation, in manipulation, in bending others to their will. But Ethan had learned to push back, and if another confrontation came his way, he would be ready. He walked to the gate, his hand resting on the cool metal, looking out over the trail. The peace he had fought for was his once again, and he would protect it. For now, at least, he had won. But as he turned to head back inside, a shadow crossed his mind. He wasn't naive enough to believe that this was the last time he'd face someone like Karen. There were more battles ahead, no doubt, but this time he was prepared to fight, and he would win. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next part, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated. See you in the next one. Your support means the world.